Hi, and welcome to the first ever Pure Investments interview. My name is Bowen Keller. I'm one of the analysts at Pure Investments, and with me I have Brett, our CTO. And if you want to introduce yourself, we have our interviewee here, Stu.
Yeah, I run Lamden, which is a blockchain company focused on kind of development workflow.
All right, cool. Thanks so much for joining us. We just have a few questions in three sections. We're just going to start off with a general overview to kind of get the idea of Lamden and TAU. Then fundamentals, kind of talk about what does it do and why will people use it and how can people use it. And then lastly, technical, talking about the actual components that, I think some people will be listening for, but the people who actually understand the technical component of blockchain and cryptocurrencies will be interested in. So to start off, give us the short version, the quick scoop. What is Lamden, and why did you create it?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of blockchain tools out there. So a lot of people are kind of saying these buzzwords and they don't really know what to do with it. And so when I started getting into blockchain as a software developer, I realized that the offerings were pretty slim. It wasn't necessarily because the talent isn't there or the technology is at all flawed. It's more that the focus of the people who are behind crypto are not focused on providing a framework or, let's say, caring about the developers or trying to make something that people will actually use, which is ironic, but everybody seems to have their own philosophies about what cryptocurrency is and down with the Fed. And a lot of these political things that really are stifling a lot of the innovation that could occur. So Lamden turned into this project that is trying to, steer away from that idea. I think it's not necessarily helpful. And so what we strive to is to make the blockchain technology much more accessible to everybody and to be able to use it just like you would a database or anything else, so that people who aren't necessarily subscribing to a lot of the political aspects of crypto can make some cool stuff. That's what I care about.
Cool. So would it be accurate to say kind of Lamden will help create a framework for blockchain development kind of deal?
Yeah. So we have our own smart contracting language that's written in Python and is interpreted, which I think a lot of people will say is a bold statement. We believe it's the opposite. We think that by providing an easier interface and doing consensus on, essentially we do consensus on it's a little more complex than an SQL query, but something like that not only allows people to dip their toes in, but it allows people to verify the outputs of their smart contracts a lot easier, and allows people who otherwise are going to be at the mercy of these strange sort of compiler errors and hacks that we see with Ethereum not have those whatsoever. So it's a different way to look at it.
That's awesome. Yeah, we definitely want to dive more into the technical component a little bit later, but for starters, just a couple more overviews so the general public can kind of get a grasp on Lamden and TAU. And next question kind of leading into that is, what is the difference between Lamden and TAU? Am I pronouncing it right? Is that TAU, or how do you say it?
Yeah. So Lamden is like the project company, and then TAU is like the unit of currency. And the reason why we make the distinction is because there's many facets in developing a developer toolkit, right? So we have this blockchain that we're building from the ground up, but it's sort of one piece of a larger puzzle. And so you want to be able to differentiate that with its own little jargon, I guess.
Okay, cool. Because I know a lot of people use them interchangeably, but I know there's a difference in them. And next thing I wanted to ask is kind of a goofy little thing, but why did you name the company Lamden and the token TAU? I think that's, because a lot of people have had questions.
Yeah. So, I mean, Lamden is like Nepalese or Sherpa for a guide. And so that's what I guess in a kind of a hokey sense, we see sort of being a guide through this blockchain technology.
Right. Okay.
And the TAU, it just kind of sounds cool. No one was using it, so that was
I like it.
It's very cool.
Yeah. Next question I guess I have is what makes TAU different and or better than other cryptocurrencies? Again, just the overview, because we're going to get more into the technical and fundamental in a minute. But
Yeah. No, I mean, like we focus on a lot of things. Like free transactions are really important to us. So we do something similar as IOTA or Nano, where you do a client-side proof of work puzzle. We are, where IOTA and Nano does not have DPoS, we do, and so we believe that we can increase throughput through DPoS has been demonstrated through other DPoS projects. So we think that one of the reasons why people don't pick up crypto is because it costs money to start programming with it, which is unique in its own sense, especially for open source software. Usually you can just download it and start playing around with it. That's not necessarily the case, at least not fully. You can make your own test network, but that's not really the same thing. We wanted to be able to create an experience so that people can innovate and explore just as much as they can create smart contracts.
Okay, so if I understood that right, in kind of the layman's talk, it's Lamden or TAU, excuse me, makes it easy for people to use cryptocurrency, whereas beforehand it wasn't. It also makes it free, which is essential for making things, because as soon as you're jumping into something that's paid, it's a lot more of an investment, you know? Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. So the currency in itself has many facets, which we can get into later, but the overarching concept of the blockchain, why the blockchain is different, is because of what you just said.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And I guess that leads into the next thing perfectly is TAU in infrastructure cryptocurrency like Neo and Cardano, Neblio, EOS, et cetera, or is this something new?
Yeah, no, I would lump it into that section. So it's definitely an infrastructural play. The infrastructural play is that a lot of these other chains don't offer that ease of use. So, like take Cardano as their smart contracting language based on Haskell, which is notoriously hard for people. However, if you speak to the developers of Cardano, they're going to be very diehard about that choice. Again, for preferential reasons, which we don't think is necessarily fair to the average developer. With EOS, it's similar, where they're using C++, which for a lot of people just is not very easy. There's a lot of things, and there's a lot of potential security risks there because it's a compiled language. So we can sandbox a lot of stuff, which is interesting.
So it sounds kind of like you keep coming back to ease of use for the average consumer and safety and security, which are both seem to be pretty key. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is the key.
Okay. Cool. Well, good to know. And I guess the last kind of overview question I have for you, just in terms of general TAU, Lamden kind of questions before we jump into some actual details, is what do you think about TAU's current price and, on the market? Because I don't know if that's something you watch very carefully or not something you watch very carefully. What do you think about it?
I can't comment on that whatsoever. I mean, just as someone who is running the project, I think that really the project itself speaks for itself, and the work that we do speaks for itself, and that's really all I can say.
Well said. Okay, well, we can jump right into the next section, the fundamental section, which generally we kind of want to focus on what does it do in terms of TAU, and why can and why will people use it? Because a lot of people think of cryptocurrencies as just things they can kind of buy and sell as a cash grab, but you're really trying to make a solid company that's fundamentally strong that can actually help out the average user, it sounds like. And so the first question, which you already kind of answered, but just to kind of reiterate, why will Lamden/TAU help people?
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to think about blockchain. A lot of people will say, oh, the cryptocurrency bubble might pop, but it's blockchain that's really important. That's where we start the conversation. So, I mean, if you think about inefficiencies in the market, a lot of it has to do with organizational automation. A lot of it has to do with proving that you have a set amount of things, or you have a set amount of records or property, for example. You can't duplicate a house, right? You can't duplicate cryptocurrency, so it becomes a tool by which you can digitally make sure that there are finite units of things. And now that's a tool that didn't really exist. And of course, there are attempts at creating that before, right? You could just have a database that has a table, but not in a way that's truly trusted by all the participants, right? When it leaves a system, let's say like a real estate agent system, like that house, it could go into the world and be duplicated, surely, right? But with cryptocurrency, I guess the details of that deed can be duplicated, but the acts of signing over that deed with a digital signature physically cannot. And that's really powerful. And because there's a whole bunch of participants in a cryptocurrency system, they all have to adhere by the same rules through redundancy. So if one guy tries to game the system, it's not really going to work. So if he tries to pass a forged deed, let's say, through the system, no one else is really going to. They don't have an incentive to allow that to happen because making an insecure system is bad for them, and they don't really know this guy, so they're not really going to do something like that. So if you think about blockchain more like that, as a tool, what kind of efficiencies can you find in the system? What kind of applications would you build on top of it? And that's why Lamden is something that we believe to be really beneficial for a lot of industries.
Right. And where does witness, delegates, and masternodes play into that? And masternodes, I believe, are called obelisks on.
Yeah, the obelisks.
So where do they all work into that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So this goes into like deeper cuts. Really, the idea is that a network, just like an organization, has different players, right? And our players are broken into three parts. We have the obelisks, which are the steady stones that hold the data of the blockchain, and are also sort of like the input points for transactions, which then get broadcasted to witnesses, which makes sure that nobody's really screwing around. There's a staking requirement for masternodes that not everybody can necessarily afford, and so masternodes holding the blockchain is a very big responsibility in terms of trust. So to have those witnesses essentially as a redundancy check to make sure that they stay in line is very important. So these witnesses are in between the masternodes and the delegates. Delegates are an elected group of individuals who the community trusts they trust them enough to sign the blocks, right? And so this is similar to like BitShares or I'm not exactly sure if EOS may have differed from this, but definitely BitShares, where there's an elected committee of individuals, and because a smaller group of people compute those blocks, it's a lot easier to push through transactions quickly because the computational work is not that hard. It's just a matter of making sure that nobody cheats the system. So if we can say, all right, if people agree to elect who they believe, and we have the election rounds pretty often, we can say through redundancy, most of the time we're going to reach consensus, and if we don't, we can have mechanisms to redo that or essentially create some sense of finality. So the witnesses themselves are the ones that get voted in. They're not the masternodes. And they have different, the reason why they want to get voted in is because they get a reward on special transactions. And so they have a good interest to make sure everything stays in place. So it's essentially a governance model that gets developed on top of this blockchain. And each player in that game has some sort of different incentives. So based on what you want to do, whether you want to stake the amount for a masternode, which is extremely large, or you want to stake a little amount for a witness, your roles and responsibilities as a good actor change over time, and it's done so in a way that creates checks and balances between each party.
Gotcha. Okay, so if I got this correctly, you have delegates, which are elected by the community or trusted representatives that then watch the witnesses and the obelisks or masternodes. Is that correct?
Yeah. So let me reiterate. The witnesses elect the delegates. The delegates are the ones that sign the block. So basically, a transaction will come through the masternode. It'll be passed on to the witnesses. The witnesses will make sure that it's valid and pass it on to the delegates because the witnesses see all the transactions. So the delegates try to change something in the block and send it to the masternodes. In that case of collusion, the witnesses can really quickly take the power from those delegates, elect new delegates, and then just keep on doing that. And so that's the purpose of the witnesses.
So with the three-pronged system, it helps so there can't be a takeover of the system from, okay, so I see. So because they're all checking each other, no system can take over on itself. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. And the masternodes necessarily, they want a good set of delegates as well. They can't interfere in who the delegates or the witnesses are whatsoever. They want a good set of delegates because they had staked a very large amount of interest into the blockchain. And so to have stable individuals is in their best interest. So you can start to see piecing it together based on these economic incentives, how you create a system that, for the most part, behaves how you want it to.
Right. Bro, were you going to say something there?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna ask. So it kind of takes homage from separation of powers in a lot of first world governments. It sounds like.
Yeah, it kind of turns into that, right? And that was almost inadvertent, but what we can be able to do then is also create like voting on not just the delegates, but voting on different variables, like let's say the amount needed to stake as a witness. Let's say that the needs change over time. The community comes to some consensus about that variable, and that variable is stored in the blockchain and used as a point of reference that everybody then has to agree upon. So then it does become like a political sort of ecosystem or simulation in a way.
That's cool. It's very cool.
Really cool. One question about that, though. You said free transactions, but you also said they're getting paid. So what are the special transactions that actually require a fee that will pay these different aspects of governance?
Yeah, so for the it's a freemium model, which is interesting, right? And so for the average user, you can compute a proof in about a second or two, right, on your computer, which most people are going to do, right? And that amount of latency is not a blocker. If you think about your day-to-day, if you are transferring cryptocurrency, you could attribute that to just the page loading on your browser, right? But for heavy users, you want some sort of anti-spam mechanism, right? And so that is also why the proof of work puzzle is there, so that you can't just push 1 million transactions per second. Now, a lot of other blockchains will do this with a transaction fee, so that it is feasibly impossible to do that because there just isn't enough cryptocurrency in the system. So our trade-off is we have this free option, right? That's going to rate limit you about 1 second. There are probably application cases where you do want to do more than 1 second and you are a good actor, right? And so by that, we can essentially introduce a transaction fee, which then gets distributed over the network. There are other situations like we automate atomic swaps, so the generation of those atomic swaps and the oracle proofs of those swaps as they have to essentially do consensus on these other blockchains that aren't associated with us. Those also require a different workload set. So those have a transaction fee according to them too. Furthermore, with smart contracts, the larger a payload gets, when you're sending something like a megabyte, right? If you send 1,000 megabytes, that's as much taxing load as 1 million kilobytes, right, or whatever. And so the proof of work puzzle gets more difficult the larger the payload is. And so with smart contracts, as transactions aren't just to from amount, they're more complex in nature, that difficulty increases. So there may be, like you may be sitting around for 5 minutes to push a smart contract out just because of how complex it is. You may then opt for the transaction cost just to save yourself some time.
Okay. Yeah, okay, that makes total sense. Makes absolute sense. So it's kind of optional for the users unless they have to be pushing a large amount, in which case they will be charged a fee, which will then be distributed to the person who are actually distributing the different transactions. That kind of covering it. Okay, and also you mentioned oracles in there. We already covered obelisks and delegates and witnesses. So can you explain oracles quickly for us?
So the way that the oracles are used is in a pretty limited use case with this network. Essentially, there needs to be some sort of way to check if an atomic swap has been created. So one of the big points of Lambda is also this interoperability idea where every single project wants 100% of people on their network. So they envision like a world computer where everybody's using it. But to ascribe certain rules and then expect everybody to abide by them does not work for everybody. It's just not possible. And so what we see is break it up into your own little sub blockchains and communities and route it through a system that does have rules specifically for routing transactions between blockchains. And that's what an atomic swap is. And so you as an individual, you meet someone, you want to make an atomic swap or you want to automate it. You want the ability to know what's in that payload without having to know exactly the way that atomic swaps are constructed on each chain. So as a convenience method, we have those tools built into our blockchain. And so if you want to verify an atomic swap, for example, you will have a group of nodes essentially parse that part of the blockchain and then respond to what the terms of that atomic swap are. So there's an attack vector where I have an atomic swap and I set the timeout rate to an extremely short amount of time so that when I send you the key and I unlock your funds, and then you have the key to unlock my funds, mine is expired and I can redeem it. So then I just took your money and then I redeemed my money. Mm-hmm. You're going to want to know that. And the way that you know that is you have to parse the blockchain, parse a whole bunch of hexadecimal code, and it's not very straightforward. So the way that we get around that is essentially with this Oracle transaction where we say, look, 50 people on the network have gone to the blockchain, and this is how it's constructed. You probably trust that more than just one individual or the individual you're working with. So we feel like that's a good use case for an Oracle, and that's why we're baking that part in.
Gotcha. Okay. So how you described it there, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point here, but you are not trying to take over the entire blockchain world with your system, but instead you're trying to let other blockchains exist and have the best possible transfer between them. And that's kind of one of the purposes, and that's specifically the purpose of the Oracle. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah.
Very oversimplified.
Exactly. And we're not even trying to take over the Oracle world either, right? Like our Oracles are specifically for this purpose, and they're baked in, and it's an understated sort of feature because we're not trying to make that the purpose of the blockchain.
Right. Okay. Cool. Really cool. Let's see. I have a couple other questions. That was really great, but I think our next question is going to go back to the names. We've talked about Lamden, we've talked about TAU, we've talked about oracles and delegates, and the next thing I think I want to talk about is a few other parts of Lamden: saffron, flora, clove, and cilantro, which are another 4 big names. If I can quickly just say, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point here, but the quick half a sentence, there we go, overview of each one. Is it true that Saffron's a project automation tool? Flora is a smart contract repository system. Clove is a really major part of Lambda, it seems like, which is an atomic swap automation tool that connects blockchains, and cilantro is your modular blockchain. I was wondering if you could speak to each one of those for a little bit and talk about how they actually interact.
Yeah, so basically, if you want to develop like a mobile application, you get a lot of stuff out of the box. So you start a new, like Xcode is the tool that you use to make iPhone apps, right? Well, first you have Xcode, and Xcode has a lot of stuff in it. It has a graphical user interface to be able to drag different components onto it. When you start an iOS application, you get a lot of code already written as to how a program interacts on a phone. Because with computers, you have to tell it exactly what to do, all the instructions. Right. So this is what's called project scaffolding. It's basically like the Rails and all that stuff, so that you just have to build the actual features of that system that you want to build. Now, because blockchain's so new, what you're seeing is that people who want more functionality than just a smart contract on Ethereum are building their blockchain from the ground up. They don't have a system that is a scaffolding that allows them to tweak and try and be able to do different things. And so that's what Saffron is. It's the ability to either create a box by which you have, like, let's say you want to play around with Ethereum, but you don't want to pay the money to send out the transactions. We can pull out a box that provides the interface for you to be able to do that really easily. Or let's say you want to use a Cilantro-based application, you want to build a completely different decentralized app, we will pull that out for you and allow you to just build what is, I guess, important to build. And we'll handle the how do computers find each other in a decentralized network? How do they interact with each other? All that hard stuff that you don't really care about and don't need to rewrite, and then you can write the actual logic to what you're doing. Gotcha. For Flora, that's where it goes into that there's also going to be a lot of functionality that's overlapped, right? So like a smart contract, let's say like a house deed, right? We'll go back to that example. There's definitely a data model for that, and that exists. And there's different functions that you want to add on to that model, like signing it, finding out who the last owner was, things like this, right? And so you probably don't need to rewrite that either. And if somebody has written an implementation of it and they upload it to the open source community, you want a way to download that smart contract. We also want a way to make sure that the original implementation of that is the implementation you downloaded. Now, if somebody takes that code, they make a little modification, they upload it, and they say it's new and improved, it's probably new and improved. But let's assume that the issue is that somebody uploads it and says it's new and improved, and they add some feature that allows them to override certain methods. And you download that unknowingly and then put that into your blockchain. It's a big deal, and it's a bigger deal for smart contracts than it is for other software. So that's what Floor is trying to tackle. It's how do you take this idea of package management, code repositories, open source, all that stuff, and then make it secure so then you don't really have to worry about it. Like, you know that this package is released by this person and you trust that person. And then you can make the judgment call as to whether or not you want to trust a new one in the future. But you know that what you're pulling down is cryptographically signed by that individual. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So just like, if I can briefly cover it again,
Yeah.
like I have been doing. So if I understood it right, you have Saffron, which kind of is the framework, the basics. You guys are doing all the hard stuff that people are going to work off the blockchain kind of don't want to be doing. And then you have Cilantro, which works off of that. You then kind of take the framework and say you can build whatever you want off of this using Cilantro as a tool. And then if I'm correct in understanding this, you then have Flora, which makes it so after they build the blockchain, then they can then make it interact with other things using smart contracts in a safe way.
Yeah, well, basically the idea is that we can provide you with the scaffolding, right? And there are things that aren't going to change, like serialization of data, pushing it across the internet. No one ever wants to change that, right? You want that out of the box. But there are things that you do want to add that people probably also have wanted to add, but not 100% of the time. Like, oh, I want a deed on my smart contract. Maybe 10% of the people do, but that doesn't mean you have to rewrite it all the time, or you want a token, right? A lot of people want tokens, but some people want special kinds of tokens. And so you want a place where you can go and find what people have already developed, add that to your blockchain. So then you don't necessarily have to rewrite even the specialized things if those resources exist. And this is how a lot of open source software works today, but not with blockchain.
So it's sort of like NPM, right? Like you'll be able to Flora install stealth blockchain or whatever if you're trying to make that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's on the smart contract level.
Cool. So yeah, that sounds great. One question I want to get back to, because I kind of skipped over it before, was you were talking about the governance model, and I wanted to talk about voting, because I know you're kind of implementing this new idea in the cryptocurrency world of actual voting, and I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, sure. So this is interesting. Everything can be modeled by a smart contract in our system, especially. And so you can model voting, and this is just one of the things that we're sticking into our implementation of Cilantro. So if you think about that, the Lamden and TAU lives on our implementation of Cilantro. It has some features on it, but some of those features are unique to our deployment that maybe you don't want in your application. Maybe you don't want voting, but we have voting. It's a smart contract, and there's different ways that you can vote for different types of variables. And this is an interesting problem, right? One of those things that we had said is who are the delegates. And so what you're basically doing is casting a vote for somebody's public key, and then the smart contract is aggregating all of that and taking the top, 32 or 64 or whatever. Now, that's one type of voting. But in the world where there's many choices and one end goal, that's a different type of voting, right? And in the US, it's first past the post. In other countries, it's something called instant runoff voting. There's different mechanisms by which you can select somebody, right? And this is good for when it's a specific variable. So like if you want to change the staking amount, or it's something extremely discrete where there's just one choice and there's potentially a lot of opinions. So each variable has its own way to select itself, right? And that's cooked into a smart contract. And even that way that you can select it can be modified. So if you say instant runoff voting is superior to first past the post, you can select that and you can change that and pop that out over time. These sorts of extremely high level functionality is probably going to be restricted for most people, so it can limit the attack vectors. But the concept of it is important because it opens up a lot of possibilities. And even things like continuous variables, right? Like continuous variables are things that can range infinitesimally, between 1 and 2, there's an infinite number of numbers, right? And so you can do things like averages or medians or modes, right? And which one works for that variable, and you get to select that, and you can mutate that over time. The whole concept of this open governance is that we can sit here from kind of like our computer stations and we can develop this. We can say this is how we think it's going to work. But as you've seen with a lot of these systems, a lot of stuff changes over time. And what's come up as a problem is the immutability, ironically, of said systems. So what needs to be immutable is the data, but what it doesn't have to be immutable is the way that you create that data, as long as you have a record of those rules being changed over time. And so that's what we're trying to capture with this open governance model.
Oh, wow. So that's really cool. So if I'm correct, this is pretty unique in the entire cryptocurrency world, because most systems are set up, exactly like you said, systems are set up one way, and that's the way it's set up. Even though blockchain is supposed to be so free, it's set up one specific way. But you guys, if I understood you correctly, are trying to do is make it so the people can kind of decide these rules, different rules kind of the system. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I will say that Tezos is one of other people who has this concept. But again, where we differ from Tezos is the aspect of complexity. Like, it doesn't have an interface that the average individual could, say, elect somebody to be a different node, or to create a new, we call them policies, that can then be used in other smart contracts. It's very obscure. And actually, it's documented that a lot of the obscurity of what they do in the code is to prevent people who don't understand the technology from using it, which is the antithesis of what we're trying to do. We're trying to allow anybody to have a voice or whatever, and then the methods by which that occurs is in a way that's safe. But we want to experiment and see what happens. We want to throw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall and see what occurs, because, I mean, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know if someone out there has this great idea, and why require them to learn a new programming language or adhere to some weird rules when they could have a lot of interesting things to say.
Okay, so really cool. So you're really opening it up. To people who may have good ideas in a safe way. And again, going back to safety, but also modification. But safety seems like it's the key here. All right, really cool. And so we talked about saffron and flora, and we talked about cilantro. One thing we talked about a little bit, but kind of skipped over, is clove, which I know is really big, really important. Something I want to talk about in clove is I also know you're making Lambdex, which is, if I understand it correctly, a decentralized exchange. But I want to ask you to explain a little bit on Lambdex and explain clove and how it interacts with it and what you guys are trying to put into production there.
Sure. So we recently released our Python library of clove. And so what needs to still be done is probably some good documentation. However, if you're technical enough, you can basically, you can install this, piece this apart, understand what's going on. We have a simple guide, but you can automate these atomic swaps and publish them to networks. So a lot of the Bitcoin-based coins are implemented. So you could use Zcash to an ERC20 token, for example, and things like that. And that's all done. The hard part is creating a group of people where that's actually a meaningful conversion. Because the thing about decentralized exchanges, true decentralized exchanges, is you want a many-to-many relationship where there's one coin to many different alternatives. Of course, it is how we also want to see Lamden being used as an intermediary token between all those. But one of the problems of decentralized exchanges is the concept of peer-to-peerness. So what Lambdex really is a decentralized exchange, in the fact that we see people posting these orders and then those orders being executed with an atomic swap. So it's direct peer-to-peer. It's more of a peer-to-peer finding, system than a traditional exchange. And we can make it look and feel like that so people feel comfortable using it. But it allows you to then trade any type of asset, not just a token, but then it goes into the house or whatever, right? For any type of asset with that individual without a broker. We're not in the middle. We just have the software. We're providing the automation tools to make that easy for you to do. And that's pretty powerful. And so we're pretty excited about that. There's probably not a lot of details about it that we want to disclose at this point in time, but yeah, it's a very cool step towards this direction of peer-to-peer movement. You guys remember me talking about, like, now we have a way to digitally create one of something, no more. We're building how to move that around easily, and that's pretty cool.
That sounds like you're taking Clove, implementing it into Lambda to kind of take the best parts of different exchanges and mix them together. So the decentralized aspect of decentralized exchanges, oddly enough, mixed with the user interface of centralized exchanges so they feel comfortable. Is that correct? And then also being able to exchange and atomic swaps with Clove, which are you guys the first to do atomic swaps? Is that the case, or close to?
No. Atomic swaps have been around for a while, but I believe that we're the first ones to create an interface that actually makes sense.
Okay.
I'll credit Decred with one of the first libraries, but it's pretty tricky to be able to understand what's going on. For us, it's extremely straightforward. If you want to extend it, like if you wanted to add your own coin on there, your own ERC20, it's like automatic. And so a lot of the extendability is there, which allows a lot of cool stuff to be made.
Cool. So again, sounds like we're going back to easy for the average user and safe, which are really, two of the most essential parts of doing anything, especially when dealing with any sort of finance or exchange at all. And did I hear in what you were saying, you want to be able to exchange more than just tokens and more than just cryptocurrencies in the end? And if I'm diving too deep, feel free to stop.
No, you're correct, because I'm saying, that everybody's like, oh, the cryptocurrency bubble will pop, and that's completely off the speculation. And the thing that won't pop is this concept of creating one of something. And so I can list my car, and you can actually know it's my car because I can digitally sign it. I can have a reputation in a decentralized way. I don't have to go on eBay. I don't have to do really anything. Craigslist is sketchy. Why is Craigslist sketchy? Because people can lie, right? And so how do you bridge the two to have, like, oh, I don't necessarily want to be beholden to somebody else's rules, right? Like a broker. But I still want to be able to know that these things are going to actually execute. And so that's what atomic swaps for. Like, I know, even in situations where the other party changes their mind or they don't want to go through with the swap, I don't lose my funds. You want to make sure that all of those things are in place. And so, that's also why we do the Oracle, right? Because I made that note of the weird edge cases that do exist with atomic swaps. Those need to be blatantly obvious to people who are using them without being like, so these are like the technical components of what an atomic swap is. You don't need to do that. You just need to, like, allow people to be like, look, red flag here. This guy basically made the expiration really, really short. Be very careful. Like the block time for Bitcoin is 10 minutes and you should wait 6 blocks. And this guy sent the expiration to 45 minutes. So it sounds like a lot of time. It's actually not, right? Be careful with this. And to do that in a decentralized way allows a lot of cool things.
Cool. That sounds awesome. Sounds great. We only have one more question in the fundamental section before we move on to a kind of special section before our technical one. But our last one is, I've heard about there being a tokenized fiat currency or stablecoin that you guys want to make and implement into Lambdex. Number one, why when there's so many others out there? And number two, do you think you could ever find an actual like USD instead of USDT sort of pairing?
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal, right? I mean, USDT is kind of sprung up by seeing a lot of the Tether things happening and being frustrated with what seems to be people taking advantage of a certain business situation. I'll go ahead and I'll do it twice instead of perhaps much, right? And there's just not a lot of competition in the space, so there's a lot of people being able to do basically what Tether can do and printing things out of nothing, and it's become a meme at this point, And so what we really want is twofold, is how do you have a dollar asset on the blockchain and then move that dollar asset in an easy way? And how can you introduce people to this idea of tokenization, which really is, like I've been saying, one of something. Not necessarily, oh, I want to buy my crypto with tokens. It's more of saying I can remit a crypto asset with USD. And if you imagine that, that's really powerful because most people deal with USD. And if you can say, I'm going to construct some type of asset and then allow the atomic swap of that between this USD bound coin, then it's cool. It's good to go. Part of the reason why we want to do that too is that we think that there can be a lot of cool innovation with smart contracts with USD token pairings. And a lot of innovation probably doesn't happen on Ethereum because no one wants Ethereum. And when I say no one, I mean like the large section of the bell curve doesn't. That's just the reality. And you can exist in this small little section of the innovation, or you can try to go for the mass adoption. That's where we're headed. So that's kind of the justification behind that project.
Gotcha. So if I'm understanding correctly, you kind of want the tokenized fiat just so it's safe, because there's so much going on about it. You guys just want to make your own that you know is good, you know is safe, and again to make the world.
Yeah. And we're trying to make it a little bit different than Tether. Like with Tether, it's not their goal is not adoption. Their goal is just, hey, it works inside of crypto land, and we want to pitch our token not just to people on the innovative early adopter section, but go to people and say this is a better alternative than PayPal because you can move these dollars and you don't have to go back to PayPal necessarily and worry about storing it there. You can put these things in a Trezor and lock it in a box, and then you're good to go. Or you have more control over where you move these funds. You can create interesting automations and things like that, payroll applications. And then you're not going to a credit card company and saying, can I move this money around? You can move the money around, right? Like I don't have a 3% charge every single time I use it. And then that makes things like microtransactions possible and a lot of innovation in that area. So it's twofold. It's giving people in the crypto community what I think they need, and then creating a compelling use case for crypto to people that actually makes business sense.
Sounds amazing to me. Sounds great. Okay, so before our technical section, which I'm mostly going to let Brett take over because he is our CTO, I firstly want to have a nice little relaxing fun questions section because I think that's essential just to kind of find out who you are. So our first question, maybe Brett, you can do the second one, is Mac, Windows, Linux, or other?
I use Mac. I'm a Mac guy.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's for all Mac guys. Okay, cool. All right, Brett, you want to ask the next one?
So yeah. Let me scroll down here. So for the second question, pineapple on pizza or no?
I feel like, okay, so most people just like make awful pineapple on pizza. I've had a good pineapple pizza, but it was a white pizza and it had like, it was really well done. Like, I don't think you can take canned pineapple and pour it on top of pizza. No. But this is nice. They had like the O's, like it was thin. It wasn't like big, like tooth-sized chunks.
Yeah. So you're saying it has to be good, like good Hawaiian, thumbs up, but bad Hawaiian, thumbs down. Okay.
It's like a really steep curve, like
there's such a controversy.
Huh?
There's such a controversy. I mean, I like it if it's good, but if it's bad, I don't like it. So I'm in total agreement with you there.
Like a Domino's pizza with pineapple on it is going to be terrible. It just is. But it's just because it's a nuanced cuisine.
It really is. And our next question, equally as important as the last one for our gamer community out there. I don't know if you game at all, but if you do, Fortnite or PUBG?
I haven't played either of those games, right? I played like Battlefield 1. I really like that, so I'm gonna go with PUBG because I think Fortnite's a little too cartoony for me. I'm much more serious about it.
Okay, cool. And our last question, this was asked by one of our community members, but I thought I'd add it in. When Binance? You don't actually have to answer that because I know you legally can't. But
yeah, I won't answer that. I will say that I think it's interesting because a lot of these companies come and go in the span of a few months. So it's almost like, for me, it's almost a rhetorical question. You could be focused on a completely different exchange just from an individual looking at these exchanges in 3 months. So you never know. And of course, as it pertains to our company, I can't get into that at all. But I find it interesting that Binance keeps coming up as almost like the stereotype when they came out of nowhere, and we don't know if they'll be around. it's interesting.
Almost a meme. So at this point, we're gonna jump into some technical stuff, which I'm gonna let Brett lead, so because he knows more about it than I do. So I'm gonna let you guys start it off. And just kind of talking about what sets TAU apart from other cryptocurrencies based upon the technical build. So Brett, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so I'll try and keep this pretty quick. But why does having Byzantine fault tolerance and delegated proof of stake set Lamden apart from other cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, so delegated proof of stake. Well, I guess I'll talk about Byzantine fault tolerance. Is just it's used in a lot of different applications, not just cryptocurrency. So I mean, we're looking at an algorithm called Honey Badger BFT, which is like an asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance application. So that's the way that nodes, well-behaving nodes, communicate with each other to move information around. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the trustless aspect of it, which is what delegated proof of stake is. So we want the ability to have high throughput, and we want the ability to have a fault-tolerant system so that nodes can come and go. It's extremely volatile, and the thing doesn't collapse. But we also don't want people to take advantage of the incentives and crypto economics, or whatever you want to call, of the system, and that's designing a good DPoS system that is robust and works. So those are the justifications for both of those.
Great answers. Great answers. So for the second question, just as my personal question, as a Python programmer myself, why did you guys choose Python over like Node or Go or something like that?
Yeah, so the thing about JavaScript is it's never been a language that is close to the metal. I think with Node, people have made the wrappers, but it's still a wrapper, right? And so things are still weakly typed. Now, Python is weakly typed, but JavaScript has some interesting quirks where you may think that something's happening on top that's not. Like certain equality statements don't behave how you think they behave, and things like that. And that alone, along with a lot of their asynchronous nature, is one of the reasons why we decided not to use it. Python is probably the easiest language that does fit those checkboxes, is that it's mostly synchronous. So you can do things like this concept of the atomic nature of a transaction, which just means does it happen or does it not? With asynchronous programming, it's very difficult because a lot of things are happening at once. But synchronous is, boom, boom. Either executes or doesn't execute. So you can do rollbacks really easily and things like that. Plus, Python's the second most popular programming language behind JavaScript. So you have this massive base of people. And it's used for a lot of different applications, like serious applications like machine learning. Django is a web framework. It really goes all the way down to the metal and all the way up to the web. So we thought that not only is it kind of used across all these different mediums, but it could be integrated in a whole bunch of mediums as well. And so we like it. It has a scientific flavor to it as well. So it allows you to do a lot of serious things that we just thought that JavaScript was a little casual.
Nice. So I think you touched on this briefly, but how do you guys afford free transactions with TAU through the network?
Yeah. So it is it depends if you want to look at it as an anti-spam mechanism or as a barrier to entry. And I think when you're saying afford, you mean it from an anti-spam mechanism. So really, you probably heard Bitcoin is taking up just as much energy as Ireland these days, and it's on the hashing power. It's not necessarily on the transactions themselves. So when a new block is created, it's not like it takes 10 minutes to decide what's in that block. It takes 10 minutes to decide what the solution to that block is. If you just ran Bitcoin without any proof of work, you'd be moving transactions extremely fast. So that's why we take the proof of work out onto the client side, and that's why we can afford ramping it up, because then the people who are making those blocks not only don't have to do proof of work on it, but they're a subunit of the network, so not everybody actually has to agree on what that block is. So one of the problems with distributed networks is that as they grow, the efficiency diminishes, because you could have someone in Africa, you could have someone in Alaska, and then to get a message between them is extremely, if you have a direct connection, it takes a really long time. And a lot of times in distributed networks, you might have pops in between a whole bunch of people that adds more latency. And you want to have finality between those two nodes, that they know what the state is at all times. in Bitcoin, everybody has that. And that's also one of the reasons why I believe it slows down. Versus with Lamden, it really just is those delegates, and if they mess up or they do something, you can vote them out, and then the masternodes hold the bulk of the blockchain in and of itself, so you don't have to necessarily clog yourself down. And I will say one thing too, is that because it's a trade-off, the masternodes have the blockchain. It doesn't mean that you can't keep the blockchain, but it also means that it's very, very, very easy to spin up more witnesses or more nodes to keep everybody in check, because you don't need to have a full sync or a quick sync. You just need the current state of the blockchain.
Very good answers, very good answers. So I think the final technical question that I've got here is cilantro is going to be kind of like a framework for applications, from what I understood, like blockchain related applications, obviously. But do you see that ever expanding in a way to things like blockchain based web applications, like WordPress on Cilantro, things like that?
Yeah, so this gets into the deeper cuts, which is still a point of discussion as to how we execute it completely. But the general sentiment is that everything can be described as a smart contract. So if you think that about inputs and outputs in the system, a node gets a transaction, it does some work, it might pass it to like a witness, it passes it to the delegate puts it in to its block, it makes sure that it works, and it puts it into, and if the block's full, it does some work. So it's a very like mechanical system where the transactions are the things that move things around. So really it's an input output of taking a transaction, doing some logic on it, and moving it down the chain or other different aspects. Now, if you say, what if the way that transactions are dealt with isn't just a logical assertion like it is with a smart contract? Does this person have enough money? If yes, update their balance. Like that could be in a smart contract. But the way that you essentially devise, okay, who are the types of people? What are the incentive structures and things like that? If you put that into a smart contract, that's interesting. So you take like a decentralized Facebook approach. You have the content producers, and then you have the people who are essentially hosting the network, and you probably have some advertisers. Now, these are three different types of people than masternodes, witnesses, and delegates, and you should be able to modify their behavior in a way that suits those needs much differently than Cilantro. So that's like the ultimate goal, is to be able to, at a base level on the software framework, devise the structures by which you can create the decentralized applications into the future. Because there's a lot of cool stuff that we're going to be able to do moving forward. And I think a lot of people probably think it's just blockchain, but it's really more or less like peer-to-peer stuff that's having a resurgence again, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think that's all very awesome. Thank you so much for answering those questions.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for the entire interview. Thank you for joining us for the interview and answering all this. Really appreciate you coming on. I think we've taken up a whole bunch of your time. We appreciate all of it. I hope that also answers all of you, the viewers' questions on Lamden and TAU. I also wanted to lastly say before we let you go, do you have anything specific you would like to say about Lamden, about TAU, anything about the company or any projects you're working on?
Nothing beyond, the general sort of, you want to get involved, you want to know more. But we have a very active Telegram group. I'm there a lot of times, so I'm able to answer questions. If you guys have any other sort of, requests or comments and things like that, feel free to reach out. And we have people there who want to talk to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on and joining us for this interview.
Likewise. Thanks, guys.